The Australian referendum on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament is now less than a week away. And I wanted to make a video where I kind of looked at the no arguments. Now, I want to be very clear from the beginning, I'm voting yes. I also want to be very clear, I'm not telling you how to vote. Your vote is your vote. And I also want to be clear that I don't think all no votes are racist. The reason I wanted to make this video is because I think that I've heard a lot of deliberate misinformation. Deliberate misinformation is not a counter-argument. It's degrading to our democracy. It is actually bonkers to me that there are no rules that say that we just can't straight out be lied to, but we can. Our politicians and our media, and I think that's part of what has made this process so difficult. But one thing I think is true is that making people afraid or confused is the best way to get people to act conservatively. And then I think that meaningful counter-arguments deserve our full attention and engagement. I'm going through objections to the voice from the conservative no, to the liberal no, to the uninformed no, to the progressive no. I'm going to break the video into chapters so you can skip to what's relevant to you below. You don't have to watch the whole video. I'm going to start by going through the amendment. I'm sure if you're Australian, you're very aware of the amendment now, but I think it's worthwhile going through. And then I'll jump into the arguments. I've tried to provide as much information as I can. The sources that I've engaged with are all below. I really recommend that you read them. I've linked quite a few articles from Indigenous X, which is run by Gamilaroi man Luke Pearson. It is a platform that is filled with the perspectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and it's really useful to engage with. So I'll get into it now. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. Feel free to reach out if you are interested in more resources. And remember to vote on October 14th. It is compulsory. This is the proposed amendment to the Constitution, adding a new chapter, Chapter 129, to create an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. It's short, it's direct, it's written in a similar fashion to the rest of the Constitution, where the general parameters of the body are set out, but the detail is left to Parliament to decide. This means that the voice has the ability to change over time to suit the needs of the day, and it also means that any concerns can be ironed out in the design process through greater consultation and the Parliament. There is a preface before the change that states that we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. This isn't just a form of recognition, it's also to explain why the Constitution is being changed. Clauses 1 and 2 of the new section entrench the key features of the voice, and that means that if the referendum is passed, there will be a constitutionally protected body called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, and it will have the power to make representations. Now, the word representations was chosen very carefully to limit the scope of the voice. The body can provide advice, but it doesn't have a veto power. It can't mandate outcomes. No obligation is placed on anyone else to wait on the voice, which might have been the case if a different set of words we use, like the voice must be consulted. This means that this is to ensure that the voice is respectful of existing parliamentary and federal arrangements. Clause 3 establishes that the Parliament will have the ability to work out how the voice operates. And that gives the Parliament the ability to make rules on composition, functions, powers, procedures, etc., etc. This is much the same with the High Court and the House of Reps and pretty much every other body in the Parliament. The voice has no legal power beyond the ability to make representation. So its effectiveness and influence will depend on how well it represents Indigenous peoples across Australia and how willing the government of the day and the Parliament of the day is to listen. Now let's go into some of the arguments against the voice. After the Uluru Convention, Barnaby Joyce said that the voice would create a third chamber of government. Now, I understand why people would think this was the case, given that these claims were repeated by then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who used this as a justification to reject the Uluru Statement of the Heart, saying that it was incompatible with Australian democracy. Now, Barnaby Joyce later admitted that he was wrong and apologised So let's just be very clear now. The Voice is not a chamber of government. It has no legislative abilities. It cannot introduce new legislation. It cannot debate new legislation. It cannot vote on legislation. It cannot reject legislation. It also cannot interfere with the work of the House of Representatives or the Senate. It is in no way a chamber of government. The wording of the amendment was purposefully and carefully chosen to limit the role of the Voice. The Voice can make representations to the Parliament and the Executive. That is all. There is no world in which a representation amounts to a final say, and there is no veto power given to the Voice. There's a suggestion that the Voice will give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people special rights. This is not true. The Voice would not give Indigenous people any extra rights, nor would it take away any rights from non-Indigenous people. The Voice will be similar to many other statutory bodies that exist, like the Australian Law Reform Commission, the Australian Human Rights Commission, the Productivity Commission. Now, some bodies, like the Australian Law Reform Commission or the Productivity Commission, appoint specific kinds of people. Economists, lawyers. We don't look at that as discriminating against doctors or tradespeople. We appreciate that those people are best suited because of their experience and expertise to provide advice on these issues. It makes sense that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people dominate a body which is meant to make representations on how policy and legislation affects First Nations communities. Furthermore, it would bring Australia in line with Article 18 of the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples, which states that Indigenous people must be able to participate in decision-making in matters that affect their lives through representatives chosen by themselves using their own procedures. In a similar vein, Andrew Bolt and Corey Bernardi made claims that the Voice would lead to apartheid. This is not the case. Under international law, in case you don't know, apartheid is the commission of inhuman acts by one racial group in order to maintain dominance and systematically oppress another racial group. Now, inhuman acts include things like murder, torture, forced labour, arbitrary detention, exclusion from political, social and economic life. There is nothing within the amendment for the Voice that gives the Voice the power to create an apartheid situation, nor is there any suggestion from First Nations people that they have an interest in using the Voice to do such a thing. There's been some concern that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice to Parliament will lead to a huge amount of native title claims, First Nations people seizing private lands. Some commentators have suggested that farmers are going to lose their land, that your backyard is at risk. This is, of course, just not possible. Once land is private, that's any grant of a freehold title, native title is extinguished. So let me just put your mind at ease with that. The wording of the amendment is very clear. The Voice is given power to make representations to the Executive and the Parliament. It is not given authority to make decisions over land ownership. Native title is determined by the High Court. For those who don't know, it is the recognition under Australian common law of pre-existing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's rights and interests in land and waters according to their traditional laws and customs. It exists outside of the Voice. There's no attempt to trick you or hide anything in the amendment for the Voice. Now, could the Voice participate in discussions about land? Of course. It could make representations. It has no authority to determine ownership of land. If you're interested, the Commonwealth actually has the power to acquire private land under Section 51, subsection 31 of the Constitution. It just has to give just terms. Many native title claims are non-exclusive leases, which means that these rights coexist with other interests in the area. Native title is only available in situations where traditional owners can prove a continuing connection to lands and waters. A really interesting objection I have seen is that this is a race-based power. This is a race-based inclusion into the Constitution. There is a big difference between race and being Indigenous. Being Indigenous is not a race, demonstrated by the fact that there are Indigenous people all around the world and they're not the same race. Being Indigenous is more similar to being a migrant or being a refugee or being a settler. It is a relationship with land and history and culture and history. I want to be very clear that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice is not an appeal to race. There's absolutely no mention of race. It is a recognition of the unique status of the first people of the Australian continent. Acknowledgements and bodies like this exist in Finland and Norway and New Zealand and Canada. And you might say, I don't want any group singled out in the Constitution, but groups are singled out in the Constitution. Groups are singled out based on whether they're part of the Commonwealth, whether they're part of particular states, for voting purposes. Groups are pointed out in the Constitution. If you really are worried about race, there is a race power law already in our Constitution. Section 51, subsection 26, allows federal legislation to be passed for the people of any race for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. This was discussed at the dialogues that preceded the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and there actually wasn't that much appetite to remove this power from the Constitution. Instead, they felt that the voice could act as a meaningful counterweight to ensure that there was some supervision of how any race laws would be used to make sure that they were being used to help and not to harm. So in terms of the race law, the voice is actually a welcome addition in terms of monitoring the use of this power. A really consistent concern that I've heard is that the voice is going to cause a complete bureaucratic breakdown, that Parliament will not be able to function. The High Court is going to be filled with expensive litigation. The voice is going to interfere with all levels of decision making. The wording does not support this. Of course, it's possible that some things will go to the court. That's true of any law or provision. That's what the court is for. It's a sign of a healthy, working, functioning democracy. Nothing is above the law, nor should it be. Let's say even if the executive refused to read the representations made by the voice, the whole purpose of it being there. Even in that case, the voice couldn't go to the High Court because the High Court has made it extremely clear that it will not interfere with the internal workings of government. It's because the bedrock of democracy, separation of powers, the voice doesn't change this. So there would not be any hold-up within the legislative chambers because of representations. When might the court be used by the voice? Let's say the court chooses to scrutinise a law that has been passed, work that has been done, completed by the government, and has found that the government or the Parliament didn't read really pertinent advice on the law. It can instruct the government, the Parliament, to go back and read those representations. However, it cannot tell the Parliament what it should decide, how it should legislate, what the law should be. It can only tell them to go back and read the representation. But even this situation is highly unlikely. This kind of bureaucratic breakdown wouldn't be the fault of the voice. It would be political ploys by certain parliamentarians. I really can't think of anyone who would suggest that acting with less information leads to better outcomes. So I really don't see a situation where our representatives would deliberately ignore representations which are given for the purpose of creating better outcomes. This was also the opinion of Solicitor General Stephen Donoghue KC, who said that the voice wouldn't generate high levels of litigation or cause issue with government processes. He said that the voice isn't only compatible with our current system, it enhances it. Something I hear a lot is, it didn't work before. And even though there have been a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advisory bodies, I assume when people say this that they are talking about ATSIC because it is often pointed to as a failure. I want to look at this a little bit more closely because I don't view ATSIC as a failure. For those of you who don't know, ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, was established in 1990 under the Hawke government. It had the ability to engage with the highest level of government to make representations on issues affecting First Nations communities. It also ran programs and delivered services. In 2005, under the Howard government, it was abolished. However, this move was supported by both sides of the aisle, so ATSIC was doomed either way. That did make ATSIC the longest running advisory body for First Nations people, running for 15 years. ATSIC's main job was to develop policy proposals, to provide advice to government, formulate and monitor programs, and it had two very successful programs which were its main focus: the Community Development Employment Projects, which is work for the dole, and the Community Housing Infrastructure Plan. Outside of this, though, it worked on programs in areas like sport and arts and legal aid and the revival of languages. It funded broadcasting for remote Aboriginal communities. It lobbied for a national Indigenous broadcaster. It defended native title when it was under threat in 1993. ATSIC responded to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. It responded to the Bringing Them Home report. It made additions to the National Aboriginal Health Strategy. It was influential at COAG, where it put forward the national commitment to improved service delivery to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It was also active in COAG's reconciliation agenda. The biggest issue that faced ATSIC was that it was used as a scapegoat by the government. Because people believed that at the time, ATSIC was responsible for every Indigenous issue. But key areas like health, employment, education were not the fiscal responsibility of ATSIC, and other things like domestic violence, housing, heritage laws, languages only received supplementary funding from ATSIC. In fact, ATSIC administered less than 50% of the entire government budget for Indigenous affairs. People at the time were very quick to claim that ATSIC misused funds or wasted money. ATSIC was actually one of the most scrutinised public administration agencies, having 10 audits between 1990 and 2000, and not only being cleared by the Australian National Audit Office every time, but actually receiving praise. In Howard's report on ATSIC, there was no recommendation that it be abolished. However, the 2003 report did point out that service providers and government departments were able to point the finger at ATSIC to avoid accountability for their own failures. The Voice will not be another ATSIC. It will not run programs or deliver services, nor will it have a budget to administer. And I know some people see this as a weakness of the Voice, but it does mean that they are less likely to be scapegoated for policy failure. I think that ATSIC clearly demonstrated the importance of having an Indigenous voice in the administrative mix. It did meet expectations. It did hold the government to account. Thanks to Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, I think the objection I hear the most is that there's not enough detail on the Voice. This one makes me a little bit mad because it's counting on you not knowing how a constitution works. The constitution is not, never has been, a document of detail. For instance, while the Constitution establishes a House of Representatives, it doesn't say how states should be divided. It doesn't say how many members should represent the divisions. How many departments should there be in the government? However many the Parliament decides. How many ministers should there be? Well, if they want more than 7, that's up to the Parliament. So it makes me pretty mad when a senior statesman, who is definitely, without question, familiar with the Constitution, because it is his job, feigns ignorance and suggests to you that there is too little detail for this amendment to be part of the Constitution. He is exploiting and manipulating you based on your lack of knowledge of something he's an expert in. I simply expect more of someone in such a high position as Leader of the Opposition. What should appear in a Constitution is the minimum necessary requirements to guarantee continued existence and essential characteristics, which is what we have in this amendment. One of the reasons that the 1999 Republic referendum failed is because people became fixated on what kind of republic we were going to be instead of just answering the question, should we become a republic? Everything became convoluted and confusing, and when people are confused, they tend to vote more conservatively. With all of that said, there has been a lot of work done on the detail when it comes to the Voice. But in order to ensure that the Voice is endorsed by Parliament, that everyone agrees to work with it, that it's able to adapt over the years, these details have been left for discussions after the referendum, as has been the case with almost all of the institutions in our Parliament at their establishment. We have a significant understanding of what the Voice is going to look like. 3 working groups of almost 100 First Nations people have been working on the detail for a substantial amount of time. In fact, there are 3 pre-referendum reports on what the Voice might look like. The Referendum Council's regional dialogues, which were part of the Uluru process, which were reported on in the final report, linked below. We have the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition, their report linked below. We have the government's Indigenous Voice co-design process. Its final report is linked below. And if you can't be bothered to read a lot of these, because there is in fact an overwhelming amount of detail, the Indigenous Law Centre actually really clearly surmised these reports and determined the 8 key principles which will kind of guide the design of the Voice. Some people claim that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are already represented, and they often point to the National Indigenous Australians Agency. Now, the NIAA is an executive agency, so it exists within Prime Minister and Cabinet. Its employees are public servants. It's an internal agency. That means it's accountable to the executive, unlike The Voice, which would be an independent body. Also, the NIAA can only advise the executive, it can't advise the Parliament. The NIAA is only 22% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and doesn't necessarily represent or have connection to the regions. Furthermore, the NIAA could be abolished tomorrow. There is no body that is selected by and accountable to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with the role of making representations to both executive and government on issues that relate to First Nations people. Another way that people say First Nations people are already represented is because we have First Nations members in Parliament and senators. The few First Nations members of Parliament and senators that we have cannot talk for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Firstly, they already have a job representing the communities they were elected to represent. They also have obligations to the parties they are a member of. Representation in terms of members of government is important. It's important so there is diversity in caucus and party rooms, but it is not the same as a deliberative body that has the ability to make meaningful representations to Parliament and the executive after dedicated consultation on how laws and policies will affect their communities. Also, when it comes to representatives in the House and the Senate, we all know elections are numbers games, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up less than 3% of the population. So the idea that a few sitting members of Parliament can do the job they're doing, plus represent the issues facing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, often fighting against their party to do so, and that if they lose their seat, we should just be okay with the fact that we've lost all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation is not good enough. Finally, there is the claim that we already all can make representations to Parliament, which is technically true. I mean, many individuals and organisations make representations all the time. Unions, peak bodies, someone writing to their local member. But having the resources to do consultations, to receive legal advice, to translate documents, to have secretarial assistance, to travel, all of these things improve representations. Having a constitutionally enshrined voice that is recognised increases the weight that representation is received with. A voice would allow Indigenous communities to have their voices heard without having to understand how Canberra works, without having to come to Canberra, without having to know what's currently being discussed. People shouldn't have to know political processes to be able to be heard on how laws and policies will affect them, and people shouldn't have to be checking legislation to make sure they're not adversely being affected by it. I think the issues that I had to give the most consideration to were the ones raised by the Progressive No. For me personally, these really made me pause for thought. And against a backdrop of complete inaction, I understand a deep mistrust of government. I think that it is crazy that in spite of the Bringing Them Home report, there are still 23,000 children living out of home. I think it's insane that all of the recommendations from the Deaths in Custody report have not been implemented. I don't understand why the government keeps approving mining projects and land clearing despite objections from First Nation leaders on culturally significant sites. I don't understand how in a country as well off as we are, there are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities who do not have access to clean water. I think delaying the report on the inquiry into the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is unacceptable. And as is often mentioned by our Prime Minister, the closing the gap targets are nowhere in sight. In fact, some of them are getting worse. And I understand that the voice feels like recognition, which I know no First Nations people really care about. First Nations people have been pretty loud in their rejection of recognition, which always seems to be offered as a consolation prize. And I understand that it would be borderline insulting to be told that you're being given a voice when you have been asking for action on the things I just went through for years. I really understand the frustration with the current campaign. I think Celeste Little, an R&A woman, incredible writer, I've linked her below, she explained that the referendum debate has been a battle between the politics of hope and the politics of fear. The same way that Jacinta Price is being disingenuous when she says that colonisation has no impact today, Marsha Langton is being disingenuous when she says that the voice would have stopped the Northern Territory intervention or the Basics card, when that's not true. Both sides have indulged in fantasy a lot more than reality. I want to be clear, I don't think the progressive no is pushing misinformation. I think it's really unfair to paint all people voting no as racist. And I think it's incredibly ironic that in a campaign to give First Nations people a voice, a lot feel silenced because they're not allowed to have their opinion. As Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they have to be voting yes. Otherwise, they're misinformed or they don't get it or they're traitors. I think that's wrong. Either you support a voice or you don't. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are just as entitled to diversity of opinion. Huge part of the reason I support The Voice is because I believe that there should be a deliberative democratic body where multiple points of view can be heard. Even if you're a committed yes voter, if you've been voting yes the whole time, these are issues that you should be keeping front of mind because they don't disappear after October 14th. These are issues that will still be true October 15 and will be important when it comes to legislating the voice. For me, the most troubling objection is treaty first. Should we have a treaty first? I have always been a supporter of treaty. I think that treaty has been the thing that has been called for the strongest by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people since British occupation. And I think it's the most necessary thing for us to have to improve outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Support for treaty was really strong at the Uluru Convention and throughout the dialogues. So I definitely don't see voice and treaty in competition with one another. I see them as part of the same process, but I really do understand why some people want treaty first. A big mirroring that I've seen in sort of the voice process is the commitment to treaty under the Fraser and Hawke governments, how consultations were led regarding treaty, how the government told the NAC to start negotiating with states, how Hawke made a commitment that there would be treaty within the lifetime of his government. And in the end, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people got was ATSIC, which wasn't nothing, but it wasn't treaty. It wasn't what was promised, and it didn't fulfill the Barunga Statement. Similar to what we see today with The Voice, where it feels like recognition and reconciliation is offered in place of treaty. So I'm definitely not blind to the sting of that historical echo. One thing that I think is promising is that we do have meaningful action on treaty in almost all of the states. I know Queensland, Tasmania, New South Wales, ACT and the Northern Territory have all committed to treaty processes. I know that Victoria and South Australia are actively pursuing treaty processes. Western Australia has started a comprehensive treaty process. Something that I think is worth noting is that the treaty process in South Australia began in 2016 under a Labor government and was suspended when the Liberals took office in 2018 and only re-established in 2022. A problem that has been encountered in the Victorian treaty is that large swaths have had to be put to the side because they fall under the jurisdiction of federal government, and they're important things. They're things like education, they're things like health. And I'm nervous that that could continue to be a reality for treaty processes throughout the states. I don't know necessarily if The Voice would help with that, but I still think The Voice is important. There are a number of things that happen with other government agency, with other levels of government, and having a voice in the room to make representation on those things is important outside of treaty. So I do think that some sort of federal level process when it comes to treaty will be necessary. I don't see The Voice at the federal level distracting away from state level commitments to treaty, and I think that's a great place for us to start. The Voice allows for the creation of an institutional body that has a relationship with state and federal governments and that has the considerable resources needed to undertake a meaningful treaty process, to be able to effectively engage with the state on a level playing field, similar to the Waitangi Tribunal, which helped communities prepare to negotiate agreements in New Zealand. And I really don't like using arguments that are like, if you vote no, that's going to give the Liberal Party and the racists a mandate to strip you of everything. But I do think that some of the people who are part of the no campaign have made it very clear that they have no interest in treaty. The Voice could definitely delay treaty because we're focused on The Voice, but not having The Voice could also delay treaty. One of the objections I've heard from the progressive no camp is that by being included in the Constitution, First Nations people will cede their sovereignty. This one really made me think twice because it intuitively does make sense that signing up to a founding document like a constitution might cede sovereignty. But international law insists that sovereignty can only be ceded through the consent or the agreement of Indigenous peoples, which historically happens through treaty agreements. This is not the case here. The voice isn't a treaty agreement, and a referendum which includes all Australian people could never be considered to stand in for the consent of Indigenous people. Also, it's been mentioned a lot of times that Federation in 1901 did not cede Indigenous sovereignty. Recognition of Aboriginal people as citizens in 1967 did not cede Indigenous sovereignty, and a constitutionally enshrined voice will not cede sovereignty. Participation in the Australian body politic, in the Commonwealth government, is not ceding of sovereignty. Sovereignty isn't the government's to give or take. Internationally, the contemporary recognition of Indigenous peoples in the constitutional documents of nation states is seen in a positive light as respecting Indigenous people and their participatory rights. The constitutional expert group which advised the Albanese government on the referendum made it clear in a communique in February that the referendum will not affect the sovereignty of any group or body. And I'm aware that the Labor government was asked to provide their definition of sovereignty and that they didn't, which was concerning. However, the issue of what sovereignty actually is quite contested, especially because Indigenous understandings of sovereignty and Western understandings of sovereignty are not the same, and they don't necessarily conflict. Associate Professor and a Mungu Yamachi woman, Crystal McKinnon, said Indigenous sovereignty pre-exists and exists independently from colonial discourses of Aboriginality. Our social movements, our political protests, our artistic and creative productions are bound together by sovereignty. They are connected because they are practices of sovereignty. This is the same for Indigenous people producing and acting in social or protest movements. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, which Anthony Albanese committed to in full, says that sovereignty was never ceded. The voice does not address sovereignty. Sovereignty is a key concern of the treaty process. The government has committed to voice, treaty, and truth. While I understand that those processes are far in the future, to me, a commitment to them suggests that the voice is not an attempt to undermine sovereignty, but that it will help express it, and that there will be a treaty which acknowledges the right to coexist. It is only Indigenous Australians who can cede sovereignty, no one else. Something brought up by the Black Sovereign movement was that enshrining the voice in the Constitution doesn't mean anything because the Interstate Commission was enshrined in the Constitution and it was abolished. This was super interesting to me because I didn't even know we had an Interstate Commission. I didn't know that this commission existed. That definitely was concerning, and I definitely had to do more reading. So there are differences between the Interstate Commission and the voice. A big one being that the voice will come about because of a referendum, which means a majority of Australian people support the voice. We all know that political branches of government are driven by public response. So starting with a referendum where the majority of Australian people and the majority of states have expressed their support for the voice immediately makes the voice different to the Interstate Commission. Having come from a referendum, if the Parliament does anything less than engage with the voice in good faith, that will have a high political cost, especially in the first years following the referendum. Another key difference is that the Interstate Commission was about trade between states. It didn't have a constituency, whereas the voice does have a constituency that will be able to encourage its existence and survival. That constituency is, of course, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people it represents. And that is why the selection and accountability of the membership of the Commission to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is so important. That is because it will only survive so long as the people it is meant to represent see it as legitimate and effective. There was no real public support for the Interstate Commission at all. Another problem that the Interstate Commission had, which the voice won't have, is there was some issues in overlap and authority sharing between the government and the Parliament. So a lot of thought has been given to the relationship that the voice will have with other constitutional institutions and principles, particularly the idea of parliamentary sovereignty and the role that the voice will play in the legislative process. This means that the incongruency that existed between the Interstate Commission and Chapter 3 of the Constitution, which resulted in it totally being ineffective, is not likely to occur. So to be clear, the Interstate Commission had no independent constituency, it had no public support, it had no no constitutional imperative in terms of like it didn't have a clear job, and it was seen as a threat to the authority of the parliament, and it was seen as undermining the judicial functions of the High Court. This is not the case with The Voice at all, and because of that, I don't think it's right to compare The Voice to the Interstate Commission. But I think it's worthy to note that things in the Constitution can be abolished. What I would say is what we know for sure is that consecutive Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advisory bodies have been abolished. And I think constitutional enshrinement could be beneficial to The Voice. Do I think that The Voice is some sort of magic pill that's going to fix all of the issues facing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? No, absolutely not. Do I think it's going to ruin democracy, that it's going to introduce racism into our country, that there are special rights being snuck in? No, obviously I don't. I think The Voice offers very little. I think it's a minuscule ask. I do not think it is perfect. I have a lot of doubts about how effective it will be. I have a lot of criticisms that this is what is being offered, especially while there's inaction on so many other Indigenous issues. But I am voting yes. I read a really good article by Milima May, who is a Kullumberigan, Nungalaba and Tiwi woman, where she said that she's voting yes with an asterisk. And that is very much where I feel I am. I think there are valid reservations. I think there are important criticisms. And I understand why that would lead some people to vote no. So I think it's really important that we move forward fully understanding The Voice and what it is not, so that if on October 14th there is a successful vote for The Voice, that as we move into the legislative process, we can make sure that we engage appropriately to make sure that it is everything it's supposed to be. In this case, I think it's better to vote yes and keep voicing those criticisms and pushing the government to make the most of this opportunity. I think that having an Aboriginal advisory body to our parliament is a good thing for our democracy, even if I don't think it's enough for our First Nations people. It is vital that the government doesn't use The Voice as a way to claim that it's done the job on Indigenous issues. A successful voice should be used by the government as a moral and political mandate to do more. Please engage with the voices and the sources that I have linked below. Listen to the voices that already exist. If you support a voice, listen now. Don't wait till October 14. However you vote, I hope you do it with careful consideration. I hope that you don't vote out of fear. You don't vote out of gallant hope. You do it because you've listened and you've considered and you've thought about what the future looks like for First Nations people in Australia.